The next stage of the Seder is Yachatz. It's taking the middle matzah from the Seder plate and breaking it in half. There are a number of attempts to try to understand what the significance of breaking the matzah in half is. Some commentators really try to see this as a symbolic gesture. The Dasakenami Baliatosos suggests that it reminds us of the splitting of the Red Sea, whereas the Shemi Shmuel, who takes a more we'll call it like a spiritual approach, suggests that the broken matzah really reminds us of the essential brokenness of the human condition and of our need for God to make us complete. However, really, on a very simple level, Yachatz is a requirement to produce the matzah that we need at the table. The obligation at the Seder is to have lechem oni, what the Torah calls bread of affliction. And the Talmud says, Madarko shel oni beprusa, that the way of a poor person is to eat a scrap of bread. Right? And by taking a complete matzah and breaking it in half, what we are producing is the appropriate prop for the recitation of the Haggadah. However, the other half of the matzah, right, is used to produce the afikomen, the piece of matzah that we eat at the very end of the Seder, which is our contemporary way of remembering the missing carbon Pesach. That, of course, was the last food that was eaten over the course of the evening in order to keep the savor, the taste of the carbon Pesach in our mouth. And that, again, is seen as kind of a fundamental law of Pesach. Today, that we don't have the carbon Pesach, the matzah that's used as the afikomen is there as the substitute. It's interesting to note that when discussing sacrifice in Jewish law, there are really two areas where Jewish law discusses the concept of sacrifice. One, of course, are the sacrifices of the Beis HaMikdash, and the second, which is almost the photographic negative, the flip side of the halacha of Karban, is in the world of Avodah Zarah, the world of idolatry. And what's fascinating is that the same forms that the Torah uses to describe the worship of God in the temple are the same forms that are used to describe how one transgresses the prohibition on idolatry. One of the primary ways of engaging in active sacrifice in halacha is through slaughtering an animal. What's interesting, though, is that Jewish law defines the act of breaking a stick in half as being equivalent, or a tolada, a subset of slaughtering an animal. And if one were to break a stick in half in front of an idol, that would be seen as a sacrificial act, and therefore one would be liable in Jewish law for an act of idolatry. Perhaps one could suggest that part of the function of Yachatz, besides to create that half of matzah that will stay on the table as a prop for the recitation of the Seder, that perhaps that act of breaking a matzah is again akin to an almost sacrificial kind of act. That what we are trying to do is create that other half of matzah that a couple of hours later during the Seder will be used to commemorate the carbon Pesach. So again, a number of different approaches to the splitting of the matzah, to Yachatz. One, to see it as symbolic, whether symbolic of something like the Red Sea, or symbolic of the basic spiritual relationship that every individual is supposed to feel with God. Or to view it really pragmatically, that it's there to create the half matzah that we need in order to recite the Haggadah and focus on this notion of bread of affliction, or that it is a gesture which actually is tantamount to a sacrificial one that is there to transform the other half of the matzah from a regular standard piece of matzah to a piece of matzah which commemorates the carbon Pesach itself. What's fascinating, and we'll discuss this really more in tomorrow's video, is that the production of this lechem oni, of this poor man's bread, is really a fundamental theme in what's going to happen in the Seder. And that the role that the matzah plays as a critical prop, and as we'll see particularly in a non-temple era, is actually very significant. So